Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tokyo Jazz Joints Pod. I had to think about that there. Let me try that again.
Have you been moonlighting, recording other podcasts or something? What the hell, man?
I don't know. Yeah, maybe I'm busted.
At least I have that excuse. I've got my own. But come on.
Right. Hi, everyone. Welcome to Tokyo Jazz Joints podcast. And this is the second in a series of 4 where we're looking at places up north. That's the simple way to put it, isn't it, James? How are you this week?
I'm feeling very professional at the moment compared to that rather choppy intro.
I don't blame you.
Yeah, I'm doing good, man. I'm doing good. I've been busy. A lot of music stuff here. I've found a good new beer supplier as well with a big stock of imported goods. So yeah, everything's rocking and rolling, and I'm ready to take another trip up to the distant north of the Tohoku region. I believe, as you said, this is part 2 of a 4-parter, but we're going to a very different city this time. I believe last week we spoke about Akita, which is on the extreme northwest, very, very distant. And today we're going to go up to, I believe, the largest city in northern Japan, except for Sapporo. And it's recently got a lot of great publicity too. About 3 or 4 months ago, very randomly, there was a very long article in the New York Times saying Morioka was one of the top places to visit in the world. So that was a bit of a surprise. But I've been up there and it is quite lovely. So I can understand people who visit Japan and want to see something a little bit outside the ordinary of just going to Tokyo or Kyoto. I can certainly vibe with them going up to Morioka. But we are not here to do the work of the Morioka Tourist Bureau. We are going deep into.
Well, apparently they don't. Apparently they don't need any help, right? Because I think in actual fact it was second on that list. So all those shopping bags are going to have to be changed now to like Tokyo, New York, London, and Morioka because it's up there. And it's everywhere because like when I went. So obviously this is a continuation of my trip from Akita. So I stayed the night in Akita with my friend Tom. Unfortunately, I'm just texting you, but I can't text you everything because I'm trying to save these stories. And if you look at the map, on your way back, if you're heading for Aomori, you have to come through Morioka because it's kind of like an exchange for the trains, right? So the trains split there. You can head back home to Tokyo or you can head further north to Aomori and beyond. So when we got off at Morioka, it was, they had this everywhere. They were really, and rightly so, right? But they were very, very proud of this thing. But as you say, we marched quite quickly past a few cherry blossom trees and what I think was a castle. It was like, yeah, that's lovely. But we have to get to Dante, right? So you've been to Dante, James, haven't you? When did you go?
Yeah, I have been there. I was there just a couple months ago. I think I've mentioned to you before, maybe on my other podcast, but I did a rather misguided 3 days going up to Tohoku.
Wait, you do another podcast?
Yes, I do have a couple of listeners.
You accuse me of moonlighting.
Just a couple of listeners, yeah, nothing compared to our bountiful audience. I decided to take a weekend. Those really great 3-day passes that I've mentioned before, where you can basically go up on a Friday and get 3 nights, but hop on and hop off the train. It's absolutely perfect for jazz joint hunting. So I decided to go up, thinking, well, I'm a New Yorker. I went to school in college. I went to upstate New York where it's very, very freezing, tons of snow. I can handle the winter. Completely overestimated my tolerance for cold weather after living in the Tokyo region for so long when it never even really snows. I found it to be pretty punishing up there. But so I was up there. I was wandering around a couple other places we'll get to on an upcoming episode. But I had spent the morning and the early afternoon wandering around Morioka, doing a little sightseeing, to sort of get a feel for why it had such a buzz. Got the famous photo shot of Mount Iwate on the bridge over the river. It was really lovely. But after about 4 hours of that, I was starting to really feel it in the bones, and I made my way to Dante, and it was really interesting because I walked in, and Philip, you might remember when you walk in, there's this just gigantic cabinet full of like CDs and books. And then behind the counter, there's like a lot of vinyl, but it's extremely cluttered. I mean, there is stuff just everywhere. Dishes, old newspapers, et cetera, et cetera. And so I walked to the right to the little sort of like customer space, and it's extremely narrow, and there was nobody there. And so not only was there nobody there was no music playing either. And I was thinking like, oh, okay, is the place closed? But the lights are on, the door was open. It was one of those weird moments where you almost kind of feel like, should I just wait outside? Because I really don't want to give the old owner of this joint a big fright when they come in and see some tall foreign man standing in the middle who they don't know, you know? But eventually, who I assume was the wife of the original owner, she came in. She served me a coffee. She put on a record. And I thought, oh, okay, it's cozy. It's nothing too exciting. It's a pleasant place and top-notch how do you call it? Crockery? Oh my God, you're gonna laugh. That's the wrong word. What do you call it? Not crockery.
I'd go with crockery.
Is that the right word?
I'd go with crockery.
Like
I'll give you that one.
Plates. Okay, good. Yeah, so they have
That's crockery.
Their own branded, small white coffee mug with Dante written on it with a nice little logo, and I always love to see that. So I was thinking to myself, okay, very pleasant regional kisaten. Nothing too special, but definitely one that I would want you to go visit, because it is very cluttery, and you know how we love that aesthetically. But then the old owner, she obviously went and called him, unknown where he was. He came in specifically to sit down and talk to me. And Philip, I am not joking, and you know that I love to talk, okay? I didn't get a word in with this guy for about 30 minutes straight. He just sat down and he said, "Are you the guy that goes to the jazz kisa?" Because I had given my business cards, and I'm like, "Oh yeah, that's me." And then he just started talking. And, my ear in Japanese is not as good as it should be, and it's certainly not good for the dialect and the accent up there. Combined with it, he was probably in his late 70s, early 80s. So I maybe only got about a third of what he was saying. But he went on a very long ramble about just for some reason, jazz education. He had a real bee in his bonnet about that jazz education was bad. And it was quite interesting because I actually agree with some of that idea that jazz shouldn't be codified in upper education. But the rest of it went off on very wild tangents that I didn't really understand, even including something about Ginger Baker. I still remember him talking about Ginger Baker.
Oh.
I don't know why he was talking about him. Maybe something to do with the intersection of jazz and rock, because Ginger Baker loved jazz and he did have some rock albums in the Kisaten as well.
Yeah, he did. Right. Yeah. He actually played. There was one particular that he was playing, I think, when we came in. Now, when we were there, it was him. He was there, albeit behind the counter initially. And there was a much younger woman who definitely was not his wife. I would say it was maybe his daughter. But what was interesting when we went was that it was, they were doing this kind of lunch set. And I mean, I know you'll be horrified. Well, first of all, when you come up the stairs, actually, there's a kind of a sign, and it's got this hand painted saxophone, but the font and which has the name of the place looks so kind of 80s. And in fact, they said, I think they've been open 46 years, which sort of just about works out as that kind of period. There's a lot of black and red in it as well, which always reminds me a bit of the 80s. And they've got those shiny,
sign. Yes, loved it.
You've got those shiny tables as well. So it's very much like, and then this really rather peculiar Russian doll of Mikhail Gorbachev, one of those Russian dolls with other dolls inside it. But it just says Gorby on it. I have a photograph of that too on my phone, so I'll put that up on the Instagram. But yeah, I mean, we went in and there was a couple of people having lunch, and I toyed with the lunch set, and I thought, oh, come on, what are you doing now? So I in the end, we just had another coffee, and by that point, I was already like 4 or 5 coffees in. I was really, but sometimes it's just the only sort of thing and the safest kind of thing. So it was very smoky, although it wasn't like there wasn't a lot of customers smoking, but I think they were smoking behind the counter. So there wasn't a lot of ventilation, and it was like quite intense. But eventually he did come out as well and asked me, what kind of thing do you like? What kind of jazz do you like? And then I mentioned Billy Harper, and he said, "Oh, well, I'll put Billy Harper on." But then we had this slightly odd exchange where he said something along the lines of, "Oh, yeah, Billy Harper's not. He's not really got the will anymore these days," or something like that. And I was like, "Oh, well, actually he's kind of online and he's quite active on Instagram and he's like playing gigs recently and all this sort of thing. So, but then I didn't want to start having like this argument, right?
I literally just interviewed Billy Harper 6 months ago about his new project. So that was, but it's also curious. It's sort of like, what an odd thing to say, because if you're a jazz fan at all, you know that these guys of a previous generation, they pretty much play absolutely until the last moment that they can no longer perform, you know? And I didn't quite, there was something about this guy, and I don't want to accuse him of having maybe some slight dementia. I don't know what it was, but there was something off about the way that he was talking to me, at least about this thing. Like so you mentioned about the Billy Harper, but he was going on quite a bit about the scene in New York, because I told him that I was from New York City, and he was going really, really deep into how, like, well, you know, jazz went kind of off the rails in New York because of something, and then the people don't really understand. And in Japan, like, it's all just a pale imitation and blah, 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 blah. Now, we've heard that before. Some of these older Kisa owners do often have a negative impression of Japanese jazz music.
Yeah, for sure.
Completely unjustified in my view, but I get it from their generation. There might be other reasons why they think that, but there was definitely something about this guy, and I couldn't quite vibe with him. And I mean, I shouldn't make assumptions about his mental state. It was more just maybe me not quite getting what he wanted to communicate to me because of his dialect, because I was absolutely frigid to the bone after 5 hours in Morioka. And also,
I mean, I had a similar
things, you know.
Yeah, I mean, I had a similar kind of experience, because you had obviously. I was on a bit of a schedule to get up to Aomori. And again, like I mentioned in the previous episode, you can't be messing around with these trains. You've got to get the train that you got to get where you need to go to on time and stuff like that. So we didn't have like a load of time in Dante, but he told, like, he said, oh, well, I'll put on some Billy Harper, but then between that and putting on the record, there must have been 15 minutes. And you had said to me, oh, just be careful, because the old guy loves to chat and like, you'll never get out of there. And I thought, well, this is weird, because like no one's chatting and we're just sitting here listening and it's fine. And then he started on this very long story. Now, again, like I picked up a fair bit of it, but it was to do with Mel Lewis and Thad Jones, I think, and something to do with like concerts in Ginza. I think Billy Harper was also involved, and something to do with like the police closing down these concerts in like the early 60s, and like this very, very kind of long, complicated story. So I don't know whether he'd gone down there or he was like, he lived down there or whatever, but eventually he put on Capra Black and played that, and then he kind of disappeared off, and then he came back out like for a bit more of a chat. But whatever way, and I think, like you say, I mean, he must be probably late 70s, mid 80s, if and so there was definitely like, he was an old guy, and there wasn't like a lot of train of thought. I mean, he was able to tell a story, but like it wasn't necessarily connected. And like you say, when you throw in the kind of like the accent and stuff like that as well, but there's a couple of like interesting things sitting about, because on the record shelves, there's the photograph, which I think we've mentioned a very long time ago in another episode about Basie. And I, of course, immediately recognized it, because when I'd been in Basie up on the second floor, I'd been coming down the stairs and I'd seen this photograph of Count Basie holding an apple. And in the skin of the apple, someone had very beautifully carved the name Basie. And I mentioned this photograph, and the woman who was showing me around at the time said, oh, yes, that was the master who carved that in the apple. So he'd carved this apple, given it to Count Basie, and he was also a photographer, so then he'd photographed Count Basie holding this apple. Now, interestingly, in Dante, they have a photograph of this apple only without Count Basie in it, but the photograph is signed by Count Basie. And then when you go into the toilet, there's actually a mirror hanging up, which has Dante and Basie has the two logos in gold lettering at the bottom of the mirror. So there must be quite a strong connection between the two. I don't know what it was or what it is.
Philip, absolutely huge not breaking news, shocking news. I didn't go to the bathroom in Dante. Can you?
That is shocking. That is shocking.
After a couple cups of coffee and walking around in the cold all day, hey, listen, Bless modern medicine. We'll just leave it at that. But damn it, I missed that. Yeah, because, and that's also, I broke one of my 2 golden rules in jazz kisa. Number 1, never order lunch. Number 2, always check the bathroom because there's always cool things in there. There's posters, there's flyers, there's weird sculptures, there's weird lighting. There's always something like interesting and fun and quirky in there. So damn it, I'm sad that I missed that. But what we do know though that, we've seen this in other regions in Japan, particularly Kyushu, but also in Tohoku. There is a lot of regional connectivity between the owners because when they would have opened their shops, we know that they used to do a lot of promotional activity to bring artists up there, to work with the city governments, to put on these shows, to host the musicians. In some cases, like with our man at Ray Brown, become dear friends with the jazz musicians, So we know that there's a lot of like relationships there. And we'll be getting into this on next week's episode. Sometimes those relationships are not very good. So yeah, be prepared for some Northern Japan jazz kisa gossip and scandal coming up soon, listeners.
God, I don't think, is there anything more niche than what you just said there? North Japan jazz kisa gossip. I mean, wow.
People are on the edge of their seat.
I'm sure they are. How will they wait 2 weeks to hear that? How will they wait?
but that is interesting.
Well, look, that was
because he did say as well. One of the things I did have in my notes that he mentioned to me that I caught was he had helped to sponsor some of the local university jazz bands. And, we've mentioned many, many times here that university jazz departments in Japan over the years have been very important in terms of not just producing musicians, but the work that they did in the community to put on gigs, to do collaborative gigs where they would open up, say, for a visiting American jazz band, putting on free festivals. So their sort of impact in the jazz world is quite strong, I think, compared to a lot of countries. So I was kind of glad to hear that he was involved with that. And I do remember, not in the bathroom, but in the stairwell, he had a poster for some sort of like local university big band that was going to have a gig upcoming. But other than that, I mean, I would say that, Dante was an example of one of those sort of quirky regional places where definitely the guy had a lot of things to say. It was just unfortunate that for multiple reasons didn't really get to understand everything that he was getting at.
Yeah, totally. Yeah, I mean, it's just another one of many. I'm just looking at some of the photos too. There's also something I hadn't noticed before, and I'll put this on Instagram when the episode goes live, but there, right beside the Gorbachev Russian doll, there is a jar that it says the word catch on it, catch something, and it looks like a scorpion in formaldehyde.
Oh my God.
So look out for that one. I mean, I don't know how I didn't notice that, but I mean, as I said, it was kind of slightly fraught morning and it had been raining slightly too, and I was not prepared for that. But yeah, Dante was a nice place. I remember, Tom in particular was really struggling when he came out. Like, it was very, very thick, the atmosphere, like it was a very smoky, very kind of intense atmosphere and not a lot of ventilation. There's one window down the back. But like a lovely place to go. And, again, just not only is you go somewhere like Morioka, there's, 3-4 more places. It's not a case of, like, as we said before, you go one city has this place, another city has this place. So just another indication of like the richness and the history and the kind of legacy of some of these places. But after I'd been in Dante, the place I went next was a place that I think wasn't probably on our radar, right? I mean, this was just digging around a little bit, and it had come up again on the Jazz Kisa map, Jazz Kisa JP map, and this place was called Kaiunbashi no Johnny. Now, I have a confession to make, which is probably that, excuse me, I hadn't really done my research to the degree that I should have done for this particular place. So in a way, I'm kind of glad, because what happened as we went in here, James, was like a lot of things kind of started to unfold. And I was thinking, oh my God, James is going to die when he hears this, because, for the very reason that I wasn't immediately clear exactly who or what this place was. So basically, we arrived at Kaiunbashi no Johnny, which in itself is kind of like a bit of a name, right? Like, it's a bit of a mouthful, right? Now, it was in one of these kind of tall apartment buildings, so it was, I can't remember exactly, but something like the 6th floor or something, right? And when you come out of the elevator, there's all this stuff on the stairs, as we've seen in a lot of these places. So there's the kind of stuff piled up and stuff like along the bottom of the stairs and this kind of stuff. And the door was there, obviously, and it was literally open in the sense of like we tried it and it was open, but there didn't seem to be anyone around. I think the sign said closed, but it was a couple of minutes before opening. So we just kind of waited and thought, right, well, we'll see what happens. And the reason this place was so, like, it was so fortunate in terms of the timing, because having looked at their website, they're only open on a Tuesday and Wednesday. So they only open 2 days a week. And happily, one of those 2 days was the day that I was passing through Morioka. So 2 minutes later, standing there awkwardly in the hallway, you hear these footsteps on the stairs, and the master appears from the floor below, and he comes up and he's like, "Oh, hello." And we're like, "Oh, are you open?" He's like, "Yep, sure." Opens the door, takes us in. And I mean, this place, James, right? So you come in, you're faced with a curtain, which goes into the counter. To your left is the toilet, and all along the walls towards the toilet, there's like books and records. And then you go right into what is a square room, fairly like largish room, but like one single room. And all along one wall is records. Then on the other side, opposite the records, there must be 5 different sets of speakers all stacked up on the wall. And then in the middle, there's a grand piano at the window. And then in the middle, there's like 4 tables, and all around the tables is like kind of bunket seating. So like if it was full, it would be quite like an intense, it would feel like a family gathering, right? Because you'd be just basically sitting in this like square room facing other people and, having your coffee or whatever. And so first of all, I'm like, oh my God, this is an unbelievable place, right? And then the owner comes out and he's like, well, what would you like? So we ordered a coffee. It's all going just as you would expect. Oh yeah, no worries. Do you want milk? Blah, blah, blah. And he brings out these 2 coffees in like, nice china cups. There's a lot of like lace about and like kind of, doilies and those kind of things as well. So it's this weird, contrast between like jazz cafe and sort of like a kind of like an older person's house. And like, it's just very, very odd, right? Like, and it's like quite early in the morning. And then he comes down, this guy, the owner, he comes down, he sits down and, has his coffee. And I'm like, okay, well, he's coming to sit with us. So then we start chatting, right? So I was like, oh, so you're only open 2 days a week? And he said, well, yes. And now you referenced this in a previous episode, right? So the Toshiko Akiyoshi Museum that you had visited, or, museum of sorts, he seems to be heavily involved in that, right? So he kind of runs that, which explains why
Yes. Okay. And here's where I'll jump in, Philip. So I think everything. We'll step back for a second. So people who've been listening the last couple episodes know that obviously, your trip back here was delayed for years and years because of the pandemic. And before you were coming, we were doing a lot of preparation about timing and where could we go together, et cetera, et cetera. And somewhere along the line, it just slipped by that you were going to go here because the story of, everyone calls him Johnny. Okay, his real name is Terui-san, Terui Ken. And, you mentioned the Akiyoshi Toshiko. So he is the guy who released or produced the first big band album from Akiyoshi-san and Lou Tabakin, the saxophonist and her husband. Okay, he produced that record. Okay, he also was quite famous for not only his gigantic record collection, and Philip, you'll remember this because after the great earthquake of 2011, you went up to do some, to help out with cleaning up. Johnny, as they call Terui-san, he lost a huge part of his collection because the cafe was in Rikuzen Takata, which is on the coast, and which was severely damaged and pretty much destroyed by the tsunami. Now, Terui-san at the time was not there. It was his ex-wife who was running the cafe. Thankfully, she was okay, but they lost a lot of the records, et cetera, et cetera. So it was quite a big struggle for him to sort of rebound from that and then open the place in Morioka. As you just mentioned now, though, he's only opening it 2 days a week, because the other days he is at the Akiyoshi sort of exhibit / museum. which I went to. Unfortunately, he wasn't there that day. So that's why, when you look at his website for the shop, it says only open Tuesdays and Wednesdays. So I think you remember we had a lot of back and forth of sort of, okay, we've got to adjust the schedule so you can make sure you make it there that day, because otherwise you'll miss it on Thursday.
Yeah. And I hadn't, at this point, I hadn't joined the dots, right? And had I been with you, it probably would have been different, but I was with Tom. So I was kind of as I was sort of processing this, and had arrived less than 2 days before. So I was starting to kind of oh, okay. And then he started to really warm up and he was like, well, actually, I produced a few records. So he started to pull out these records on Johnny's disc on the label, right? Which again is one of these kind of cult, Japanese record labels. And obviously, we all know now that a lot of this Japanese jazz has become so collectible and so popular and all this kind of thing. So he started putting out these records one by one. And then, he pulled out this Eiji Nakayama album and it's signed by him. And he's just oh, and I did this one and I did this one. And da-da-da. So I'm oh, okay. So this is Johnny. Right. Okay. This is Johnny's disc, Johnny. And I'm starting, these things are starting to kind of slot into place. And I'm oh my God, this is amazing. And so all these highly expensive and collectible Japanese records are now gathered in front of me, right? And on this table, I'm just this is mad. Then he disappears, right? So he comes back and he's in Japanese, he says, do you know this? And he's holding the BBE J-Jazz Volume 1, 1969 to 1984 compilation, right?
Magic.
So he comes out and he's just standing in front of me and he goes, do you know this? And I said, well, yes. I said, those are my photographs on the cover. And he just went, what? And he just lost his mind, right? He started to slap me on the arm. Then he shook my right hand, and at the same time, he took my other hand. So we've got these hands crossed. He's shaking both hands. He's going, ureshi, ureshi. He's happy. I'm so happy. Then he puts the record down, and he reaches down and gives me a hug, James. And I was I don't think I've ever been hugged by a man in Japan in 20 years, in that way, right? It's just what is happening? And he just was so delighted that he'd made this connection. And I obviously was thrilled, right? Because I was this is mad that this compilation happened way back now, 5, 6, 7 years ago. It happened in London and somehow it's made its way back to him. And what was really interesting was then he basically said, and again, I'm sort of still coming down from this and trying to piece this story together, but he said basically, I think his licensing is held in Tokyo and he got this phone call to license 2 of these tracks. So 2 of the tracks he's produced are on this BB J-Jazz Volume 1. And he'd been yeah, that's fine, got them licensed or whatever. And then he wanted to know what this compilation was. Now, if I followed the story correctly, he called the owner of Eigakan to find out what's the story with this record. And of course, the owner of Eigakan, his photograph is also one of the ones that's featured on the J-Jazz Volume 1 cover. And he said, oh, it's this album. Da, da, da. So Johnny then sought out this BBE album. So he has this album. So he's standing here with this one record, which is this Umio Miteta, Johnny, which is a live album by the Sakamoto Teru trio at the old place in Rikuzen Takata. And he's also holding in his right hand the BBE Volume 1 record. And James, I'm going to send you the photograph now. And I want you to tell me, have you ever seen a happier looking person than the man holding these 2 records? I mean, it was just one of the nicest experiences I've had in all of these places that we've been to over the last 8 years.
That's just beautiful. Yeah, you've got to get that. You've got to get that up on. You've got to get that up on the site. That's incredible. Now, Philip, it's just so amazing because again, usually you and I, and especially considering we had 4+ years to get our stuff together. But yeah, this shop, for whatever reason, and obviously we mentioned on a previous episode, your flights were delayed. There was a lot of chaos going on. So somehow it sort of slipped by us because we should have known.
Yeah, I mean, and you'll see this in the photo, but there's a huge sort of manga image of him in his younger years on the ceiling as well, actually, along with the posters that I mentioned earlier. And I also photographed it. There was at some point a manga actually about the original place in Rikuzen Takata. So it's kind of interesting, and I think also, we live in a world where people do multiple things, often because there's no way to make a living doing one specific thing. So that contrast between, turning your hand to different things and being successful, and then this prizing or this kind of prioritizing of like this one single pursuit, like we talked about maybe, with somewhere like the owner of Bird 56 and those kind of places where it's never been closed. It's just this singular pursuit, and it's who's to say one is better than the other. But what was really interesting was actually the other album that he's holding, the Sakamoto Teru Trio album. He released that, he said, in 1980, and then he opened his cafe in 1981. But what was interesting was that when we were discussing the BBE record, he was saying, "Oh well, Japanese jazz becomes so expensive," and I was like, "Yeah, it's crazy. People are paying crazy prices for it now, and this kind of thing." And he said, "Well, actually, I've been trying to find this record. Now, why he didn't have it, or maybe it was lost, or as you mentioned, the tsunami or something like that. But either way, he didn't have a copy of this record, so he actually went online to try and find it. And I mean, this was kind of like off the back of already this amazing thing, and like being hugged and being like shaken very hard. He was so excited about the BBE thing. He was like, "Well, I actually went online, and it was like, over like 100,000 yen." And he's like, "That's just crazy." So he was looking to buy this record that he himself had produced all these years ago. And so then he got this message from a customer who was in Athens on holiday, and he was like, "Oh, I've just seen your record." And so Johnny was like, and at the time his wife was also there, so the two of them were kind of telling the story, and he was like, Athens. And he's like, at first he was like, I couldn't understand why my record would be in Athens. And then of course he remembered that in 1982 he'd gone to Athens on holiday, and he'd taken this record.
Wait. You said 1982.
Yeah, and he'd gone to Athens in 1982, and he'd taken this record on holiday, and this record he'd given to this record shop owner, and he said, "Would you display this?" And that record had been sitting in this record shop in Athens for 40 years. Now, the customer bought it and brought it back. So the record that he was holding was this record. Like, how insane is that story, right?
That's just fantastic. But, Philip, it's incredible. I mean, we, over and over again, in a sense, and look, I don't want to take credit for this. This is a happy outcome. It's not something that we planned, but the fact that we've been doing this project, working with BBE, helping to sort of promote the Japanese jazz world, especially the Japanese jazz kissa world as well. But we've seen that there's such a great appetite for it among music fans overseas, and again, people here are surprised by that. So I'm actually really happy though that Johnny got to get the record back from a customer. I mean, he must have just been shocked, especially because this isn't in Tokyo. It's not the easiest place to get to, right? So the fact that after 40 years he was able to get that back is just nuts, and
it's absolutely incredible.
Reaffirms that the music that quality of Japanese jazz as well. I mean, we mentioned some of the kissa owners aren't that into it, but Johnny spent his career producing these albums and getting them out there, and it's obviously had an impact,
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I just thought it was phenomenal, and that was off the back of already this whole kind of excitement around this thing. So, we had to move on, and he actually was like, "Oh, you have to go." I mean, we could have sat there, right? You could have sat there all day and just talked and chatted, but had to move on. Places to go, places to photograph, and so on. So we left there, and again, they escorted us out into the lift. We had that sort of slightly awkward thing, sometimes in Japan where people watch you leave and the doors don't close quickly enough, and we're sort of waving, and then my last image of him was blowing a kiss to me as the doors closed. He blew a kiss, and I was like, this is just not gorgeous. What I expected this morning. So that was Morioka. We hightailed it back to the station, and we jumped.
I'm so bummed then, because when I was in Morioka, I was, so as I mentioned, I was there on a Friday. And so I would have expected to have seen him at the Akiyoshi Museum / exhibit in the bus station. But
Yeah.
nobody was there. And I spent about an hour looking at all of the memorabilia and stuff because it was really, really beautifully put together. There's so much stuff, you know. And then right across from it is a sort of a little coffee place because there's also a hotel lobby there on the second floor. And so I sat and had a coffee for another 45 minutes or so, but nobody was there, you know. And I just thought, oh, okay, you know, I mean, it's Japan. I mean, you think about in other countries, you certainly wouldn't be leaving these glass cases of very, very old and sometimes probably valuable jazz memorabilia unattended. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And there it's just like, oh, it's fine. Nobody's going to hassle with it. But I didn't get to meet him. Of course, I know, you know, I know people that know him, and I'm sure that if I go up and I say, hey, remember that Irishman with the camera that came by a couple months ago? You know, I'm sure I'll get the warm welcome as well. So I'll make sure that I try to get up there on a Tuesday or Wednesday. But Philip, yeah, and absolutely, I'm just, you know, you've been teasing it now for weeks, saying that like, oh, you know, I've got some stories, man, but I'm going to save them for the podcast. And I was like, yeah, all right. They're not going to be that good. Well, whatever. That's fine. I've had it.
It's just one of those layers, you know. It's like, you know, we started this project, we photographed some places, then these photographs end up on this first kind of, you know, fairly pioneering compilation of these, you know, really at the start of the whole J jazz kind of interest. And then somehow that ends up back there, and then you go in and happen to meet him, and you know your photos are there. And I was like, "That's us on the back. That's Tokyo Jazz Joints. That's my name." And you know, it just one of those really beautiful like things. And you know, he was so happy that it just made me think, you know, there's such a value in doing these kind of things, and like all the effort and the money and all these things that, you know, like we've put into the project just kind of make it worthwhile. So we hightailed it back to the station and jumped on the next Shinkansen to Aomori, which is where we're going to pick up things in the next episode 53, in a couple of weeks' time.
Can't wait. And Aomori, you know, the most northern part of Honshu Island, famous for a lot of different things. Three, actually, in my case, four absolutely superb jazz spots. So I can't wait to talk about them, Philip. And man, it's so great to be back recording again. And before we go, of course, a little bit of PR. Philip, as I mentioned on my recent podcast recording, when I was, you know, because I actually make a very intensive effort to promote Tokyo Jazz Joints, although the opposite would not be true. But as I mentioned on mine, I said, listen, we all know that worldwide we have had fans contact us that they love the show, and I mean, how can you resist two middle-aged men, one of whom is, you know, a little bit drunk and gregarious, one of whom is a little bit moody and off-putting, talk about their adventures visiting jazz cafes in Japan? I mean, it's an absolute winner. It's never been done before, and it will never be done better. So thank you, listeners. Philip, thank you for your hard work editing, and I can't wait to continue the story in Aomori next time.
No worries. Someday we will learn to love each other. In the meantime, take it easy. Have a good week, and I'll talk to you. Bye.
Ciao, ciao. Bye-bye.